and general remarks and concrete case studies picked up in the French research regarding migration and international mobilities. Is my accent okay? Okay, fine, thank you. This was the first disclaimer. So, second, my first part. Behind the globalization, there is the regionalization of migration flows. Behind globalization, regionalization refers to an increase in exchanges between territorial units located in the same parts of the world, which increase more rapidly than with the rest of the world. All flows are likely to be regionalized. Tourist flows, international migration or mobilities, development aid, telephone and electronic communication, international investments, international trade, and so on. Everything can be regionalized, even political action. The regionalization means that international migration has increased more rapidly within groups of close countries than between very distant ones. And this phenomenon is relatively little taken into account by the scientific literature, especially in the French literature. The global geographical picture of migration is pretty complex. At the beginning of the 21st century, international migration took off in an unprecedented way and became globalized. Europe became one of the first destinations in the world, and the whole planet is on the move, especially in the south. New destinations appeared, for example, the Gulf countries, African continent, Asian countries, and countries of departure became, step by step, host and transit countries, such as in Southern Europe, Mexico, Turkey, Maghreb, and so on. International migration has tripled since the mid-1970s, and this process will continue because the factors driving mobility are structural. Differences in levels of human development, political and environmental crisis, falling transport costs, the lack of hope in poor and badly governed countries, the role of the media in disseminating certain images of potential destinations, and the aware that one can change the course of one's life through international migration and so on. Last point, in this global picture, the flows to the south have recently, the flows to the south of the planet recently outnumbered those to the north. Actually, the globalized world, in fact, is pretty much regionalized in many domains. Migration is organized geographically within large areas of space where complementarities are built up between sending and receiving areas. Within the American continent, for instance, most of the migration flows to the United States come from Latin America and the Caribbean. And in Southern American countries, the host countries, the main host countries, I mean Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Venezuela, mainly receive migrants from neighboring Andean and Central American countries in particular. In Europe, 42 million migrants were born in a country other than the one in which they live, but another European country. And besides, Europe operates in synergy with the southern shore of the Mediterranean, which is very classical, and with sub-Saharan African countries up to the equator. South Africa absorbs most of the flows from southern African countries, and besides, at the continental level, 1 in 2 African migrants migrates to another African countries. The Russian world is another migration system with approximately 13 million foreigners, and Russia attracts, through its natural resources and labor needs, the population of Muslim republics that have become independent in the so-called Central Asia, as well as from the Chinese Republic along its eastern border. In East and Southeast Asia, rich and or aging countries such as Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore attract Chinese migration, and the Philippines, where 1 in 10 inhabitants lives abroad, offers an abundant labor force in the region. There is another regional movement from, for example, from Indonesia to Malaysia. especially in the rural areas. Australia and New Zealand, once largely populated by Europeans, are attracting now migration flows from Southeast Asia, and the wealthy and sparsely populated Gulf countries, on the other hand, are attracting south migration from the southern shore of the Mediterranean, from Middle East, and from Eastern Africa, Pakistan, and the Philippines. In fact, regionalization is not a phenomenon which is closed on itself. Regionalization is in fact linked to globalization. If we take one example, in West Africa, from Nigeria to Senegal, West Africa is the largest migration receiving region in Africa. West African migration is much more numerous within the region than outside, and the region is home of an estimated 7.5 million migrants, most of whom originate from another West African country. We observe a combination of two migration fields. I will come back to this concept, migration field, in the second part. We observe a combination of two migration fields, south-south and south-north, with a double polarity defined by the colonial heritage on the one hand, and the post-colonial links of dependence and center-periphery links on the other hand. First, the West African migration system is characterized by flows towards coastal African metropolises, which is very classical, and by intercontinental migration directed towards the industrial regions of the former European metropolises. West Africa is, in the same time, a globalized migration field connected to the world. For example, human trafficking takes place on different scales. First, many migrants are exploited within ECOWAS, which is a regional organization in Western Africa. The CDEAO or ECOWAS is the same. The migrants are exploited within ECOWAS or in other regions of the world, more or less distant. I mean Central Africa, Persian Gulf countries, Europe or the United States. The girls recruited for prostitution or sexual abuse come from Mali, Benin, and Burkina Faso in particular, and have been exploited in Nigeria, Libya, Saudi Arabia, Italy, or the Netherlands. West Africa and the Maghreb are in fact at the intersection of several trafficking routes. Young girls under the control of a boss in Morocco or Algeria are recruited in Burkina Faso, Côte d'Ivoire, Gambia, Guinea, Conakry, Nigeria, Senegal, and also in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And there are flows on the opposite direction. From Bangladesh, for example, victims of trafficking are taken by Pakistanis to Calcutta in India. They cross Pakistan, they reach Iran, they cross the Arabian Peninsula, they enter the African continent via Djibouti, they reach Zambia, and are eventually transported by Nigerian gangs to Senegal and to Europe, mainly Spain and Italy, their final destination. Now I come to my second part. What concepts and vocabulary is used to describe the regionalization of international migration? French geographers and sometimes sociologists are interested in the geographical distribution of international migration. It's a fact, it's commonplace. To describe migration, they have been using over time, for decades, concepts such as migration système migratoire, or migration field. In French, it is champ migratoire. Champ migratoire or migration field. I think it is not a very good translation, but I do not have anything better. The migration field, according to Gilda Simon, who is a specialist of migration in France, is a space crossed and structured by a set of relatively stable and regular flows of migrants, whatever their origin or destination. The concept refers to a specific space structured by significant flows, and it encompasses both the country of departure and the country of residence and or employment of the migrants. This concept does not only refer to the geography of the places concerned by the flows. It is more than that. It allows identify the specificity of the space constructed by a given group at different scales, at different level, whatever its scales, local, national, regional, intercontinental, and global. For instance, the migration field of Moroccans, according to Gilles Dassimon, who are established in a fairly large number of European countries and who are now settling in North America, is wider and more open than that of Algerian and Tunisian, who remain concentrated in a smaller number of countries, including France. This concept is used by many geographers. I just point two examples. Of course, Gilles Dassimon applies this concept since the 1980s, 1990s to the relational space forged by and constructed by Tunisian migrants between France and Tunisia. And Michel Toinard, for example, also uses it to refer to the transnational migration space of the Portuguese throughout Europe and on the other shore of the Atlantic Ocean. In fact, the notion of migration field and to a certain extent migration system comes from English-speaking research in the 1990s and 1980s. One of the main researchers in this domain is Douglas Massey, who defined the migration system in the beginning of the 1990s. According to him, an international migration system generally includes a core receiving region, which may be a country or group of countries, and a set of specific sending countries linked to it by unusually large flows of immigrants. His research is partly based on research made by other researchers such as Fawcett and Zlotnik at the same period of time. A migration system perspective yields several interesting hypotheses and propositions. First, countries within a system need not be geographically close, since flows reflect more political and economic relationships than physical ones. Although geographical proximity obviously facilitates the formation of exchange relationships, it does not guarantee them, nor does distance preclude them. Second, nations may belong to more than one migration system, but multiple membership is more common among sending countries than receiving countries. Third, as political economic conditions change, systems evolve, of course, they are dynamic construction, so that stability does not imply a fixed structure. Countries may join or drop out of a system in response to social change, economic fluctuations, political upheaval, and so on. I want to end the first section of this part with a few remarks. Everything that is said above can be applied, in fact, to spaces that are made or not made up of neighboring countries. The concepts of system and field do not explain the regionalization of migration flows in itself. The regionalization of flows is observed, it is empirically described, but there is no overall specific theoretical framework to explain it, to grasp it. It is probably necessary to look for factors specific to each regional system in order to explain its geography. The classic framework for explaining regionalization is very descriptive and underlines several factors. First, there are complementarities. Complementarities are built up between nearby sending and receiving areas. But why are there neighbors? Why would there be neighbor? Why would not there be neighbor? No one knows it. They are neighbor by chance, in fact. Second, there are largely this system are largely inherited, built at a time when long-distance travels were difficult and costly. These complementarities persist over time in a kind of path dependency fashion. Third, they correspond to geographical proximity, historical, linguistic, and cultural links, and transnational networks built by migrants, and the meeting of factors that attract and push labor. Last, migrants wish to be able to return regularly to their country of origin, so the geographical proximity may be therefore an asset. I come now to the second section of this part. Other approaches have recently emerged in the French research based on constructivism and transnationalism, which is also the case, of course, in other countries. It is not typically French, of course. Geographers no longer analyze the places and living spaces used by migrants as a succession of spaces with delimited borders, but as a plurality of autonomous and articulated fields. The effectiveness of individual and social actors in the migration dynamic unfolds in a regionalized and globalized context with which traditional institutional and political actors can no longer totally control. Migration studies are often placed within the framework of transnationalism. It refers to the process by which migrants construct social fields that link, or champs migratoires, that link the country of origin and their country of settlement. This opens up research perspectives by observing the links, movements, and activities that connect migrants with their place of origin and with other outlets for the movement of people and families. There is a form of globalization, in fact, coming from below, carried out by migrants as an alternative to the globalization promoted by the major economic, financial, and political institutions. In recent years, French geographers and sociologists have abandoned the concept of migration system, more or less abandoned. They emphasize the transnational circulation initiated by migrants and how this contributes to strengthening the dynamics of regionalization. In this framework, they speak of mobility territory. This is an expression used, for example, by Laurent Farret, mobility territory. They speak of multi-situated territory. And there is a sociologist called Alain Tarius who speaks of circulation territory. The study of migration is then not limited to the settlement of migrants in a particular country. It also focuses on the multiple forms of relationships, economic, family, emotional, and so on, woven between the different places that make up migration spaces structured by circulation. I now pick up three or four examples. First, Laurent Farret studies the contribution of Mexican transnational communities to the structuring of a circulation space or territory between Mexico and the United States. Shadia Arab observes circulation between Morocco and the European Union, and she identifies a regional circulation territory specific to migrants belonging to the Ait Ayat group. It is a group of Berber population settled in the Atlas Mountain. And other studies insist on the constitution of a Mediterranean space of intense commercial circulation driven by migrant merchants collectives, especially the research by Tarius, Peraldi, and also Camille Schmoll. For example, Alain Tarius and Michel Peraldi study circulating migrants as economic actors of globalization and regionalization, Mediterranean regionalization, who participate in the globalization of exchange and regionalization of exchange by developing informal international trade from the northern to the southern shore and on the opposite direction. Last, Thomas Firsch studies the role of kinship in the structuring of Italian communities that are dispersed across Europe. He has shown, for example, that Italian transnational families are structures in real households covering several European states. Intra-family relations are structured by care mobilities on an intra-European scale. He observes the mobility of grandparents who help their children, who have become parents, scattered over several European countries. These are flying grandparents whose mobility is facilitated by free movements and by the existence of low-cost flights, and thank you, Ryanair and EasyJet. The mobility can be short, this Italian mobility can be short, I mean on demand, or long and ritualized in the form of family tours of Europe lasting several months. Last remark in this second part, some geographers work on the concept of circulation with a quantitative approach. If I take a look at the work of Virginie Babicolin, Geneviève Cortés, Laurent Farret, and an Italian colleague, Susanna Sasson, they have recently proposed a circulation index intended to identify the ways in which people move, the coming and going, the round trips within circulation territories. It permits to measure the intensity of circulation through the articulation of three criteria. First, the repetitiveness of movements. Second, the duration of migration activity, I mean the longevity of the migration practice. And third, the cumulative duration of stays abroad, the time of presence. I now come to my third part. The geographers also look at the political dimension of regionalization. They search for the relationships between what we call regionalization and what we call regionalism. There is a political explanatory framework that can be applied to migration flows in regionalism. The formal or informal space of circulation formed is sometimes accompanied by institutional facilities for passage and eventually by regional multilateral agreements. And geographers are therefore very much interested in the normative or regulatory spaces that are constructed, and thus in the political and institutional aspect of the geography of migration. Doing so, they are not the only ones in the world, of course. Sociologists, political scientists, lawyers, specialists of law are doing the same. The geographer assumes that the regionalization of flows is determined by regionalism, that is, institutional arrangements between neighboring countries designed to facilitate flows of migrants or to regulate them. Regionalism allows states to cooperate in certain areas to address issues that cross their boundaries, building up scales or relevant geographical perimeters better adapted to these issues. International migration attracts the attention of states and favors regionalism. Migration management system within the European Union, for example, attests to the will of member states to protect the region from external migration flows while facilitating the migration of member states inside the European Union. The edification of a so-called Fortress Europe, materialized by the border control mechanism of the Schengen area, underlines the common objective of migration regulation. This can be found in other parts of the world. I mean, the European Union is not an exception. Several West African countries have created the ECOWAS, a regional economic framework that has led to a common approach to migration and simplified movement. And in 2012, a free movement agreement between Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan ended a visa system between these countries, which was previously settled in the 1990s. In the same vein, the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, emphasizes the notion of migration regime. A migration regime is a set of regulations relating to migration and migrant status that applies across a state or a region, I mean a group of states. For example, the migration system or migration regime of the Gulf states is characterized mainly by two things. First, a particularly high rate of foreign population in residing countries. Migrants represent 34% of the total population in Saudi Arabia and 87% of the population in the United Arab Emirates. I think it is a world record. Second, This system is characterized by a strong political regulatory element called kafala, K-A-F-A-L-A. It is a legal system according to which each foreign worker must be sponsored, and the sponsor, the kafil, being the guarantor of his migration and of the temporary nature of his presence. Some researchers propose, to finish with this notion of regime, some researchers propose a Foucauldian approach of a regime. They are attentive to the control and coercion inherent in many migration regimes. And in this sense, the idea of a fortress Europe can be read as a critical geography version of the notion of a European migration regime. In the institutional and political perspective, the case of the European migration regime is very interesting in several respects. The EU is a unique case based on a dual migration regime in the OECD fashion. It is a migration regime closed to a certain extent, close to the arrival of regular mobility from the south. The member countries are organizing themselves to build a common policy base to protect from such arrivals or to regulate them. The Schengen area of free movement in the same time has been fundamental in strengthening regional movements. The intra-regional migration are of different types. They are more or less qualified. They come mainly from the south to the north and from the east to the west. They concern workers, students, and pensioners. This regime is in fact fragile because the increase of intra-European migration has caused negative reactions in some European states and has contributed to a certain extent in England to the development of a pro-Brexit opinion. And even just after the accession of Poland in the European Union, there were major campaigns in France against the Polish plumber, for example. So there are, in fact, if I go up to a more general levels, there are debates and questions about what I've just said above. Intra-European migration, even after the opening to the east, to the new member states, remain a very limited phenomenon, despite free movements, or perhaps, maybe, because of it. Rather than settling in another country, Europeans prefer other forms of mobility, circulating mobility, to other countries, such as tourism, cross-border movements, or short study trips. Generally speaking, does migration regionalism based on multilateral regional agreements promote migration between neighboring countries? This question exceeds the issue of migration and has been asked for decades about international trade, for example, by economists such as Jacob Wiener, who made many research about the diversion of creation of trade based on regionalism. Research made by James Baldwin and research made by Paul Grumman. And the debate is still going on. So the relation between regionalism and the dynamic of international migration is also a subject of debate. Geographers, to finish my third part, geographers also observe what happens at the peripheries of regionalized migration regimes, particularly at the peripheries of the normative space of the EU. I take two examples. First, Fanny Schaeffer analyzes the interweaving of networks of all kinds, which from the 1970s onwards led to the densification of the space practiced and structured by the Moroccan migrants, to its extension and multipolarization. And she observed the increasingly restrictive framework of European migration policies which leads to long-term settlements in countries of employment. Because of the restrictive framework settled by the European Union, the Moroccan migration field is step-by-step transforming. Some migrants prefer to settle for a long period of time in a country, some others search for other destinations, and some decide to engage in clandestine migration. Shadia Arab studies the Beni Ayad group from the Middle Atlas, and she shows that their mobility and non-mobility from Morocco is caught up in the contradiction of spatial and regulatory systems between the considerable openness of the Moroccan migration field, the diversification of its routes, the splitting up of its paths throughout the Mediterranean basin, and the assignment to residence imposed by the European policies. Now I come to my last part, and I will put the stress in this part on the relationship between international migration or mobilities and regional integration. First, I will start by defining the concept. What is regional integration or macro-regional integration? In a constructivist perspective, macro-regional integration, be it based on international agreements and treaties or not, refers to the creation, development, and enhancement of interactions between distinct but contiguous territorial units located in various neighboring countries in the same part of the world. This process ultimately evolves towards the construction of spatially contiguous multi-state autonomous regional systems and interactions between constituent spatial units, in this case between countries, within this large macro-regional system are stronger than those with spatial units located outside. The macro-regional entities thus constructed are positioned between the state level and the global level on the map of the world. From a theoretical point of view, the growing international migration inside EU are strongly related to the process of European regional integration. To explain this process, there are 3 or 4 main theoretical frameworks. I won't present all of them because I'm afraid I will be boring in 1 minute. So I will limit my presentation with 2 of them, maybe the most popular. The first one is the neo-functionalist approach, which was developed after the Second World War in research made by a famous politist, Ernst Haas. In this approach, regional integration is described with reference to the interaction of 3 factors. First, the growing economic interdependence between nations. Second, the organizational capacity to resolve disputes and build international legal regimes. Last, the supranational market rules that replace national regulatory regimes. In this neo-functionalist approach, the end of the process is the creation of a new whole, in geographical terms, a new space, a new common space, a new whole that is more than the addition of the parts. The European Union space, on a theoretical level, is more than the addition of the 27 spaces of the member states, of course. So it is more than the addition of the parts. This approach assumes a decline in importance of nationalism and the nation states. It is a step beyond nationalism. In the new regionalism approach, the region is not a given a priori. In fact, there are 2 approaches. If you take a look at the neo-functionalist approach, they say that European Union is a region. In fact, it is a question. It is not sure. If you take a look at the distribution of European norms and international migration, you can observe that all the neighbor countries are involved in this functional space. The EU, to a certain extent, is a part of a larger ensemble. But for the neo-functionalist approach, EU is a region, NAFTA is a region, Mercosur is a region, and so on. In the new regionalism approach, a region, and a macro region, a multi-state region, is not a given a priori. it is not necessarily settled by an international treaty. It is a social construction, and in this perspective, regionalization can be described, or regional integration can be described in terms of increasing levels of regionness. That is the process whereby a geographical region is step by step transformed from a passive object to a subject with a capacity to articulate the interests of the emerging region. The process of integration is one in which a portion of space, no matter how small it is gradually filled with enough economic, institutional, political, cultural, and identity substance to become a system distinct from others and finally be perceived as such by the persons living inside and by those living outside. At the final stage, a regional integration at the final stage of the regional integration process, there is a regional society. At this stage, the region is sufficiently integrated to become an acting subject with an identity, a capacity for political action, an institutional structure capable of making legitimate decisions in the eyes of a self-aware transnational civil society. According to these theoretical frameworks, regional integration supposes the intensification of flows of persons between states involved in the process in order to achieve regional integration. Growing contacts, horizontal contacts between civil societies of neighboring countries help transferring allegiances from national to supranational institutions and give way to the formation of regional civil society by disseminating shared preferences and shared social representation. Now I come to the last section of my last part, and I will shortly develop 4 examples. In the case of the European Union, the links between regional integration and migration and mobilities can be studied in several ways. One interesting topic is the international student flows. I have been studying this with Clarisse Didlon for a couple of years. European integration paves the way for the increase of flows of international students because it is an integrated territorial system inside which internal barriers, namely the border effects, are lowered. Flows are supposed to increase faster inside the EU than between the EU and the outside. They are supposed to increase in every direction thanks to the diffusion of the same norms and regulation all over the European space, and thanks to the good accessibility, more or less good accessibility of all parts of the common market. What about the flows of international students from Central Europe, from the new EU members who recently accessed the European Union 15 years ago, more or less 15 years ago? As far as Erasmus students are concerned, we can observe 2 or 3 interesting things. We can see a strong attraction of Western EU member countries, mainly Germany, Spain, Italy, France, etc. And Erasmus students coming from new member states prefer to go mainly to the West and less to other Central Europe countries. It means that Central Europe is step by step de-regionalized, in fact. And it is replaced by a process of regionalization whereby the Central European new EU members are sticking themselves to the western part of the European Union. And if we consider all types of flows, and not only Erasmus flows, according to the data released by the UNESCO, there are several geographic profiles in the new EU member countries. Polish and Roman students go everywhere in the Western EU and sometimes beyond the Atlantic Ocean, while Czech and Slovak and Estonian students are much more concentrated and focused to certain countries, mainly Germany, Austria, etc., or Sweden and Finland. The links with the East former USSR countries, which prevailed during the Cold War, have not totally disappeared in the last 2 decades. Some new member states still attract students coming from the former USSR, but the USSR, on the opposite direction, is no more a destination for international students coming from the new EU member states. I come now to my second example, and I will shortly present the research made by Mila. Mila Sanchez studies the mental and social representations of Europe by migrants from the new member states in France and Wales. Doing so, she proposes a bottom-up approach to regional integration. Regional integration cannot be reduced, it is one of her postulates, it cannot be reduced to institutional or political logics. There are non-institutionalized, even unintended forms of regional integration, and functional regions of different sizes are built independently of regional agreements signed by governments. Civil society actors contribute to the regional integration process as much as, if not more, than the government decisions. The increase and regionalization of migration flows from the new EU member states to the old ones are low-key factors in the ongoing integration process at the EU level. Mila Sanchez is particularly interested in the spatial representations and identification process of migrants that contribute to European regional integration from below. She assumes that shared representations of EU or Europe would be a sign of integration in a spontaneous fashion, not driven by the governments and the treaties. Or not totally driven, because there is the Schengen regulation, of course. She observes the relationships between the way European space is represented in mental maps and the practices of international migrants interviewed. She looks for a relationship between mental representations of Europe, the length of migration, and the life course of the migrants. The interest in using the term from below is to highlight the role of a category of actors that is little studied or overlooked or even minimized in the field of regional geography. I come now to my third example. There is also a geopolitical dimension of regional integration connected to the issue of EU territoriality. The notion of EU's borders is increasingly appearing in the newspapers' headlines in connection with recent external migration crises. Some newspapers now do not hesitate to talk about the borders of the EU, implicitly giving it a classical territoriality. Usually, territoriality and territory are concepts associated with the idea of the sovereign state. EU is not a sovereign state. And the newspapers tend to give a simple representation of this border by clearly opposing an inside and an outside separated by a clear, common, single, linear border. This representation is very much geopolitical, in fact, in the sense that EU territoriality has been competing with that of the member states of the time. It is really a geopolitical question. It is because it is a subject of tense relation between the European Commission and the governments of the member states. When the Italian government sees Frontex agents coming to its border on the Mediterranean shore, they are not all the time very well welcome. There are many examples in the French press of these headlines. I just pick one or two of them. For example, in the most read daily published journal in France, West France, in February 2022, I just read one headline, one title: to protect its borders, the European Union wishes to deploy resources to Senegal. And a second example, in the journal Le Monde, I don't know how to translate it in English, le casse-tête. Le casse-tête. The tricky dispositif, I don't know how to translate it. Le casse-tête des frontières extérieures de l'Union européenne. And the last one in the newspaper Le Figaro, November 2021, the nations that protect the EU's borders cannot be left alone. Cannot be left alone. The nation that protects the EU's borders. That was in July 2020 and November 2020. In fact, there is a fruitful field of research, including comparisons between the French press and the press of other EU countries. How does the perception of migration pressure give rise, step by step, implicitly, to the idea of a European territoriality in the public opinion, competing with that of the member states via the idea of an existing EU borders? Now, my last example, another geopolitical aspect is the externalization of migration management, which challenges the traditional conception of border. Faced with the migration crisis that began in 2010s, several European initiatives were launched, and some of them were launched before that. We can summarize this initiative by distinguishing the pillars of the so-called externalization of the European border. First, the signature of agreements with neighboring countries. Migration control brings, for example, financial, diplomatic, or commercial counterparts to the countries who accept to sign those agreements, especially Morocco and Turkey, for example. Second, the use and diversion of official development assistance in third countries. EU development assistance finances the operational reinforcement of Niger's border posts and supports Niger's police services to reduce the transit migrants. In fact, this money is not supposed to be used like this, but it is used like this by the European institutions. Third, there is a direct intervention of European actors outside the territory of the Union. European agents are in Niger, for example, or Niger, I don't know how to pronounce it, to provide advice, training, and assistance to the Nigerian authorities in the fields of security, in the field of fight against terrorism, organized crime, and irregular migration, and blah, blah, blah. Four, there is the passing of a law criminalizing the smuggling of migrants, which is theoretically more severe than the former law on trafficking in persons in Niger, and the application of this law is facilitated by the collaboration of European actors present, European Union officials present on the ground in Sahel. The fifth dimension is the outsourcing of asylum policy, relocating the reception and accommodation of asylum seekers and the processing of their asylum application to places close to EU's borders, but outside EU, or to countries outside the EU through which the applicant transits. Last, the readmission agreements and mobility partnership with countries eligible to the European Neighbourhood Policy. Just one example, in 2013, an EU-Morocco mobility partnership was launched in order to manage the movement of people. And this agreement is supposed to facilitate the granting of visas, it is a counterpart, the granting of visas for certain category of people coming from Morocco, namely students, researchers, and business people. Doing so, and I will end my presentation with this, doing so, the EU blurs its external border. It builds up what the political science called a fuzzy border. A fuzzy border. They are very famous work made by Christiansen, Petitot, and Tonra. They are specialists of political science who speak of fuzzy border. Second, EU builds a transgressive border zone that advances deep into the territory of neighboring countries by exporting norms on the territory of the neighbor countries. And third, it builds a reticular border, a network border of frontières réseau that connects all the places located in the EU airports, for instance, on the mainland border of the EU, border checkpoints, for instance, and in the territory of many countries scattered throughout the world, in consulates, embassies, international liaison officers, and so on. So EU is building step by step what is much more than a simple linear border. Thank you.